Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining me today because we have some very exciting General Hospital news to talk about, and it's definitely worth the wait. At the edge of relief, when everyone believed the worst had already passed, a far more frightening truth began to rise quietly in the life of Brook Lynn Quartermain. The moment Jordan Ashford opened her eyes after the accident, something shifted in the air, something heavy and impossible to ignore. Memory, once blurred and mercifully distant, returned with cruel clarity. And with it came a truth that Brook Lynn had desperately hoped would remain buried forever. Jordan remembered everything. She remembered the road, the sudden movement, the loss of control, and most devastating of all, she remembered that Brook Lynn had been there, that Brook Lynn had caused the chain of events that led to that near-fatal moment. For Brook Lynn, this was not just fear anymore. It was the quiet collapse of everything she had been trying to build. Inside the Quartermain mansion, the world appeared calm on the surface, almost tender in its stillness. Brook Lynn sat beside little Phoebe, telling a softened version of the story, one that carefully avoided the sharp edges of truth. She spoke about swerving the car to avoid danger, about nearly hitting a guardrail, about how everything could have gone wrong, but somehow did not. In her version, there was no other victim, no consequence that lingered beyond that moment. It was a story crafted not only to protect the child, but to protect herself from the unbearable weight of guilt. Yet beneath her calm voice, her heart carried a quiet terror. She knew that if she had stopped that night, if the police had arrived, everything would have fallen apart. The alcohol she had consumed before driving would have exposed her, and with that exposure, her future with Phoebe would have disappeared. The dream of building a family with Harrison Chase would have been destroyed before it truly began. While Brook Lynn lived in fear of what might come, Jordan's awakening brought a different kind of storm. In the hospital, surrounded by the sterile quiet of recovery, Jordan struggled to piece together the fragments of that night. Curtis Ashford stayed close, offering comfort and recounting what he knew, while Lucas Jones stood as a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. At first, Jordan's memories felt distant, like shadows that refused to take shape. She listened, she nodded, she tried to accept the version of events being given to her, but something inside her resisted. Something refused to stay hidden. The turning point came not through logic, but through emotion. A simple moment of closeness, a gesture meant to reassure, suddenly unlocked what her mind had tried to protect her from. In an instant, the memory returned with overwhelming force. She saw herself turning away from the road, allowing a brief distraction to take hold. She felt the panic, the loss of control, the violent correction that followed, and with that realization came a crushing wave of horror. Jordan believed, at least for a moment, that she herself had caused the accident, that she had crossed into another lane and overcorrected in a way that led to disaster. The guilt settled in quickly, heavy and suffocating, yet even within that realization there was a question that refused to fade. When Jordan asked about the other driver, the answer she received only deepened the mystery. The other car had not stopped. There had been no accountability, no confrontation, only absence. This detail lingered in her mind, creating a quiet tension between what she remembered and what did not quite make sense. And as her thoughts continued to settle, the truth began to take a more dangerous shape. Because memory is not always immediate, and sometimes it returns in layers, revealing deeper truths with time. What made everything even more fragile was the emotional and physical state Jordan found herself in after the surgery. The shock that overwhelmed her was not just about the accident. It was something deeper, something tied to her body and the life she feared she might have lost. Before the accident, there had been uncertainty about whether she was pregnant. She had convinced herself that she was not, perhaps out of fear of complicating an already delicate situation involving Curtis and another woman. But now, in the aftermath of trauma, that uncertainty returned with terrifying urgency. Her reaction, that sudden gasp of realization, carried the weight of a question no one was ready to answer. Was there a child? And if there had been, had the accident taken that possibility away forever? While Jordan faced these painful questions, Brook Lynn stood on the edge of a very different kind of reckoning. The possibility that Jordan's memories would fully return was no longer a distant fear. It was becoming a certainty. And with Jordan's decision to take legal action, the quiet life Brook Lynn had been trying to build began to fracture. The adoption she longed for, the stability she wanted for Phoebe, the love she shared with Chase, All of it now hung in the balance. Every choice she had made in that moment on the road was coming back to confront her, and there was no easy escape. What makes this situation so heartbreaking is not just the danger of exposure, but the emotional conflict that lies at its center. Brook Lynn is not simply running from the law, she is running from the truth about herself, from the realization that one reckless decision could cost her everything she values. And Jordan, once a victim struggling to recover, is now a woman driven by a need for justice, even as she grapples with her own guilt and uncertainty. Their lives, once separate, are now bound together by a single moment that neither of them can undo. In the quiet spaces between fear and truth, the tension continues to grow. Brook Lynn waits, knowing that every passing day brings her closer to being exposed. Jordan searches within herself, knowing that her memories are still incomplete, that more may come. And somewhere between them lies the full truth of that night, a truth that has the power to resurrect everything they hold dear. The lawsuit struck Brook Lynn like a blow to the chest. Until that moment, she had been living with fear in a private and almost manageable way, telling herself that maybe the truth had not fully come together, maybe no one could prove what happened, maybe the terrible night on the road would remain a shadow she could carry alone. But the legal papers made everything real. They turned panic into something official, something cold and public. Brook Lynn was no longer simply afraid of guilt or shame. She was afraid of prison. She was afraid of losing the fragile future she had just begun to build. Most of all, she was afraid of losing the baby she had already started to love as her own. That fear only grew worse because the case against her touched the most vulnerable part of her life. For Brook Lynn, this was not just about punishment. It was about motherhood, about the one chance she felt she had been given to create something pure and lasting out of a life that had often felt messy and uncertain. Phoebe had become more than a child in her home. She had become a promise of healing, a reason to believe that Brook Lynn could become better than her worst choices. The idea that one reckless night could destroy that dream was unbearable. She could face scandal, she could face judgment, and she could even face family disappointment, but the thought of having Phoebe taken away filled her with a deeper terror than anything else. As the news of Jordan and Curtis' crash spread, Brook Lynn's mind returned again and again to that awful drive. What had once felt like a blurred memory now became painfully sharp. She could see the road, the sudden movement of another vehicle, the violent rush of fear, and the instinctive turn of the wheel. She remembered the sick feeling that settled over her afterward, the dreadful sense that something had gone terribly wrong, even if she had kept driving and forced herself not to look back. In the hours after hearing what happened to Jordan, Brook Lynn could no longer hide from the possibility that her actions had been connected to that catastrophe. The memory would not leave her alone. It pressed on her conscience until it became impossible to breathe without feeling its weight. In that state of growing desperation, Brook Lynn reached the point where pride no longer mattered. She wanted only to survive what was coming. It is easy to imagine her trying every possible path to avoid prison, not because she believed herself innocent, but because fear had overtaken reason. A frightened person does not always act with dignity. A frightened person reaches, begs, bargains, and clings to any small chance of mercy. Brook Lynn may have found herself wanting to go to Jordan directly, hoping that emotion could soften what law could not. She may have wanted to explain herself, not to erase the damage, but to make Jordan see the woman behind the mistake. In Brook Lynn's mind, perhaps there was still a slim hope that if Jordan understood how much Phoebe meant to her, some part of that anger might lessen. But even before facing Jordan, Brook Lynn would likely turn to the one person in the Quartermain family she believed could understand the darkest corners of survival. Tracy has never been a woman who lives by softness alone. She knows what it means to protect family at any cost, and she understands that truth is not always the same thing as safety. That is why Brook Lynn, trembling under the pressure of her own secret, might finally break and confide in her grandmother. The confession would not come from strength, it would come from emotional collapse. Brook Lynn had been trying to hold herself together, trying to behave as though normal life could continue, but the lawsuit would break that illusion. In Tracy's presence, the fear she had been swallowing for days would finally spill out. For a brief moment, that confession might almost feel like relief. There is comfort in finally telling the truth to someone who knows how cruel the world can be. Brook Lynn may have hoped Tracy would comfort her, shield her, or tell her that everything would somehow be all right. But Tracy is not the kind of woman who responds to crisis with softness first. She would likely become still, sharp, and very serious. She would understand immediately that this was no longer a private moral struggle. This was now a legal threat, a family threat, and an adoption threat all at once. And in Tracy's eyes, that would change everything. She would see that Brook Lynn's tears, however sincere, were dangerous if they led to confession in the wrong room, to the wrong person, or at the wrong time. That is what makes Tracy so powerful in a story like this. She would not look at Brook Lynn simply as a guilty young woman. She would look at her as a mother on the brink of losing a child and a future. Tracy could very easily decide that the truth, however painful, must now be managed rather than surrendered. She might urge Brook Lynn to stop crying, stop spiraling, and stop speaking carelessly. To Tracy, silence would not be dishonesty for its own sake. It would be strategy. It would be protection. If Brook Lynn wanted any hope of remaining Phoebe's mother, Tracy might believe that self-control mattered more than remorse. In that cold and ruthless logic, admitting too much would not make Brook Lynn noble. It would make her vulnerable.